make a start. So the basic question which we're faced with is the fact, let's just mute everyone 1 second. Okay, here we go. So the basic question that we're faced with when we look at Parshas Mishpatim is that civil law, which is of course the main focus of Mishpatim, are surely basic for all civilizations. They are basic for humanity. And the question is, what is the difference with these and the general perspective on civil law? What are we deriving, what are we taking from Parshas Mishpatim in terms of the Toras perspective on these laws that is different and distinctive from the basic human requirements and human necessity and necessity for civilization to function? So I'd like to first begin with the Abarbanel. There's an Abarbanel where the Abarbanel has a very distinctive approach towards his Perush on Chumash. He tends to ask several different questions, and then he presents a long analysis which ties in and tries to respond and answer all of the different questions that he's posed. So rather than looking at the entire everything he says, I really would like to focus on one particular point that he brings out. I mean, the Abarbanel's question, his primary opening question, is the same as almost everyone else asks, which is, why does the parsha begin with the halachos of Eved Ivri? Why is it that this regulation in terms of the way we treat avodim, where we treat servants, is specifically the beginning of these are the mishpatim you shall place before them? He goes through several of the most common answer, perhaps that we're familiar with, is the relation, of course, to the beginning of the Aseres HaDibros, so that you begin the Aseres HaDibros, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Asher Tzisicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, right? Hashem says, I took you out of Egypt. So it makes sense that we parallel that with the notion of how we treat avodim, how we treat servants ourselves, is of fundamental importance. But then the Abarbanel says something I think is absolutely critical towards understanding this whole parsha. He says like this: they were meant to tell, these mishpatim, these civil laws, were meant to tell the Jewish people, to tell the Bnei Yisrael, he says you've got to look at the short second set of the Aseres HaDibros. If you look at the second set, they're all very, very brief. Lo sirtzach, lo sinov, lo signov. You shouldn't steal, etc., etc. You shouldn't not to murder. They're all very, very brief. He says the ordinary, regular, and normal, straight-thinking person would understand that these are obligations, these are essential for society. Without them, society cannot function. And we find that most of them were commanded to the rest of the world as well, as part of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. He says, look across the world, look at all other forms of civil society, and you will find laws of this nature. To murder, to steal, they're all there anyway. So therefore, he says, and he says society can't function without them. He says, so why is it, what is the Torah trying to demonstrate with Parshas Mishpatim? It's trying to demonstrate as follows, that within these particular commandments, there are many other aspects and there are particular elements that give them a divine nature. He calls them Mishpatim Elokiyim. And it is this aspect of them that was specific to the Jewish people, that, if you like, fills in and augments those particular commandments and helps understand the essential nature and what they are about. And therefore he says, says the Abarbanel, it specifically begins, Mishpatim and the Torah in general begins following on straight after the Aseres HaDibros, begins with the second set, the way we relate to others, the way we treat other people. Corresponding to the instruction of lo sirtzach, do not murder, the Torah brings other types of murder that a person can do to someone else. The horishon mehem, he says the very first one, if a person acquires someone else to serve them, if enslaves the person for their entire life. That is murder whilst the person is alive. And he goes on to explain that just like you find with tzedakah, the notion of a giving tzedakah to someone brings them back to life, literally gives them life, so too, if you take away a person's freedom for eternity, what you do is effectively deny them the right to life. And I think what the Abarbanel is bringing out here is something absolutely critical. Of course, the essence of basic civil law exists in all societies. But what the Torah wants to do in this parsha is provide the broader perspective, the attitude that the Torah wants us to develop through those instructions, those brief diburim, lo sirtzach, lo sinof, lo signov, the list in the second set of the Aseret Dibros, how we conduct ourselves towards others, and the sensitivity that we need to live a moral and ethical life. That is what we're looking at critically here. And that is the Be'er Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Salant, also in his Pirush at the beginning of the Parsha, he brings he discusses this in a similar vein. He brings the Medrash that we're all very, very familiar with. The Medrash which says that Hashem went to all of the nations of the world before he gave the Torah. We're all familiar with it, even very young children. Everyone knows this Medrash. And they asked him, they asked him what's written in the Torah. Hashem gave a response to each of them and says, well, this and this is written. For example, he said to Esav lo sirtzach, it says you shall not murder. Liyishma lo signov, to Yishma he said do not steal. La'amanamov, to Amanamov he said lo sinov, do not commit adultery. So we learn that, as always, in a very, very simplistic way. We approach the Medrash, unfortunately, in a very simplistic way. As the children's song goes, he said to other people, do you want this gift of mine? And they said, no, thank you. For Torah, there's no time, right? That's the Uncle Moshe version. So we learn that Medrash in a very simplistic way. They rejected it. We can't manage with that. We can't not murder. That's part of our civilization, part of who we are. Ask yourselves a question for a second. Really? Is there any civilization that is built that they can't accept lo sirtzach, do not murder? Really? Is that really what, the descendants of Esau could not accept the principle of not to murder? They might have a bloodthirsty society. There might be all sorts of problems with society, but to not accept the idea of lo sirtzach, says Rabbi Yosef Salant, the Medrash means something much more than that. He says like this, the idea of going to offer it to the rest of the world was that every one of these instructions is tuluyim b'midos. All of them are about ethical conduct, the way we behave towards others, the midas that we have. The idea, he says, of derech eretz kodma la Torah, derech eretz precedes the Torah. Kadei lirosim heim yaskimu reishis kol. Hashem wanted to know, first of all, would they agree to the Yesodos v'ho'ikoriim, the key principles, the foundations that are the hachana to the Torah? They are what prepares a person for the Torah. And once they were not, what it means they weren't prepared to accept them, means they weren't prepared to accept the idea that the Torah itself would need to transform the personality, would need to transform and uplift the person in the way they conduct themselves towards others, their ethical and moral outlook on life. That was what they couldn't accept. And that was why the Torah was not for them. He says, fascinatingly, he suggests that this is the idea of the testing that went on with the Jewish people as well. It says in Parshas B'Shalach, Sham somlo chok umishpat v'sham niso, Parak Tesvav Posuk Chofei, that there Hashem established for them a chok, a statute, umishpat, and a judgment v'sham niso, and there they were tested. What is the testing? They also were tested. They were tested to see whether they had that delicacy of the soul, the idea of being able to strive for something higher in life, to live an ethical life, an ethical and moral life that is the thrust and the entire meaning behind the dinim and the mishpatim, the laws and the judgments, the whole of civil society. Only then, when they passed that test, were they able to then go ahead and receive the Torah. In other words, the judgments, the mishpatim, the justice in this week's parsha is the framework. It is the framework for establishing a person's entire moral and ethical personality. So the question is like this. Now that we've established, now we understand what the function of Parshas Mishpatim is and why it exists, specifically following on from the Aseret HaDibros and Parsha Shiur. The question is like this. What is the underlying principle? What is the principle that enables and facilitates this attitude? How is a person meant to develop that approach, that sense of the importance of living a moral and ethical life? What is the one underlying principle that underpins the whole system? And for this, I think, we need to take an approach which notices certain details in the Parsha. And the Parsha is so wide-ranging. It has so many mitzvahs in. They used to call this Shabbos, or Soloveitchik says, they used to call, I think this Shabbos was the Shabbos of Toras Shabbal Peh. This was the Shabbos of the oral law. This was the Shabbos of Toras Shabbal Peh. They used to, I think the Chevra Shas would have a Kiddush on this Shabbos. This was about Shishos Sidrei Mishnah. That's what the whole Parsha is. You learn through much of the Nezikin and quite a substantive amount of Noshim. A lot of it is there, and Moed as well. It's all here in this week's Parsha. So we have to develop, I think, a sense of the underlying message and the meaning. And I'd like to bring out here 3 examples of where the Torah has a very unusual phraseology, because I think this is where we begin to develop the key towards understanding what this parsha is really about. If you're following in a Chumash, look at Perek Chof Aleph Posuk Chof Tes. If you're not, it doesn't matter. If you like to follow in a Chumash, it's nice. Something like to see it inside. So we are on Posuk Chof Tes, Perek Chof Aleph Posuk Chof Tes. We have the story of the goring ox, the ox that tragically kills someone. First, we have the scenario of an ox that has never acted in this way previously. And then we have V'im Shar Nago. If the shor is already established as a goring ox, mitmol shoshem, it's done it 3 times. V'huad b'v'olav, and the owner has been warned, v'lo yishmerenu, but he didn't take care of the ox, didn't look after the ox, didn't prevent it killing. The hemis ish shor went ahead and killed someone. Hashar yisokel, so the ox shall be stoned. V'gam ba'olav yumos, and it says the owner shall die too. Says Rashi, what does it mean? The owner shall die. The owner has to die because his ox caught someone? No, it means misa, not misa b'dei odom, misa b'dei shamayim. The owner is effectively condemned through a misa b'dei shamayim, death at the hands of heaven, through not guarding the ox. And then you have the next pasuk, im kofer yushas olav. If kofer, the kofer payment is placed upon, there's a penalty which the owner can pay. The nosan pidyon nafsho, and he gives the redemption of his soul according to everything that's been placed upon him. In other words, there's a get out of jail free clause. If the person doesn't want to die, what do you have to do? You got to pay. Now ask yourself a very simple question, right? Who would not make that payment? Everyone's going to make that payment, right? Every single individual is going to make that payment, and therefore, the gamba olav yumos, the condemning to death, right, of the owner, when is it ever going to happen? That's the question, right? When is it ever going to happen? And yet the Torah says, "V'gamba olav yumos," the owner shall die. And then in kofer yushas olav, if the kofer penalty, the payment is placed upon him, then he doesn't die. That's the first question, first example. Let me give you the second one now. Perek Chof Aleph Posuk Lamed Dalet. You have, and we'll link these 3 together afterwards. You have the story of the bar, the Chiyaftach Ish bar. Someone digs a pit, right? Opens a pit, digs a pit. Posuk Lamed Dalet. Perek Chof Aleph Posuk Lamed Dalet. Bala bar Yishalem. The owner of the bar has to pay. The owner of the pit has to pay. Someone falls in. There's an accident. Something happens. What does he have to do? He has to pay for the damages. Says Rashi. What does it mean? Baal habar yishalem. The owner of the pit has to pay. Says Rashi. Baal hatakola. The owner, the one who created the pit in the street, one who put the stumbling block there, has to pay. Even though the pit doesn't belong to him. Parsha Shiur Rabbi. He made it, he put it in a public thoroughfare. Therefore, asoy hakosuv ba'alov. The Gemara says, in Bava Kama, the Torah makes this individual the owner of the pit to become liable for nezikin, for damages. And again, hold on a second. Does this person own that land in the street? No. The Torah makes you the owner in order to make you liable for damages caused through digging the pit in the street. So that to the extent that you are considered and treated as the owner of the land, but you're not really the actual owner. So what is going on here? Why does the Torah describe it in that way? Makes you the Baal HaBor, the owner of the bar, the owner of the pit. And the third example, and one that you will all be very familiar with, Perek Chof Aleph Posuk Chof Dalet, and the ensuing Pesukim as well. Ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, shekel tachas shein, a tooth for a tooth, yad tachas yad, a hand for a hand, and regel tachas rogel, and a foot for a foot, right? Now, you read the pasuk, it says, you knock out someone's eye, your eye should be knocked out. And we know, though, of course, that the Gemara goes to tremendous lengths to prove, to demonstrate, it's absolutely crystal clear that this is not actually, we don't believe in the principle of knocking someone's eye out because they knocked your eye out, right? That's not what we do. We don't do that at all. What we do instead is we pay a monetary penalty. That's how it is. It's a monetary penalty. So I'll ask you the simple question. If it's the case that it's a monetary penalty, and the Gemara has to turn head over heels, and Chazal all the way through have to go to great lengths to prove, which they prove from the Pesukim themselves, by the way, through the fact that it talks about how you have to pay for medical fees, etc., etc. They prove that it must be that it cannot be a literal eye for an eye. So why does the Torah phrase it that way? Why throw in that element of confusion? And by the way, historically, this created all sorts of problems. Megillas Tanis lists certain days that became days of celebration as well, as a result of certain events that took place. In Megillas Tanis Perek Daled, it describes how on the 14th of Tammuz, there was a day that was established, the 14th of Tammuz. The day was established as a day as a Yom Tov. Why? Because on that day, they managed to disprove the Sadducees, the Tzedokim, the Baitusim, who used to say, if someone knocks out someone's eye, ayin tachas ayin. They took the Pesukim literally. You knock out someone's eye, your eye is knocked out. And they did this, and they actually put this into practice. This bloodthirsty way of treating someone who committed such a crime, because they read the Torah literally. The Chachamim proved to them that this cannot be right, this is not correct, and that the Torah must be viewed as a combination of the written law and the oral law, Torah Shiur Rabbi and Torah Shiur Rabbi. And eventually they managed to win the day, and they celebrated it as Yom Tov. So you see that it was a major problem. There were elements within the Jewish people, fringe elements, splinter groups, who actually took this literally and created major problems as a result. So why did the Torah put it that way? So the straightforward answer, and this is clear from the Ibn Ezra clearly seems to understand it this way, is of course that the Torah wants to phrase it this way because the mindset needs to be ayin tachas ayin. The Ibn Ezra says, it's just one line in the Ibn Ezra. He says, "V'nei pirush ayin tachas ayin, ayin for ayin, roi lios einoi tachas einoi im lo yitin kofrei." If you would not pay, it would be correct and right by all accounts that his own eye should be knocked out. The mindset that the Torah wants us to develop is a sense of personal responsibility. That is the element, I believe, which underpins the entire parsha, and is particularly borne out by these three examples, and I'm sure there are more as well. The Torah wants us to develop a mindset of personal responsibility to the extent that it is as if our own eyes deserve to be knocked out if we would do that to someone else. That it should be to us as if we actually own that parcel of land in the street. If you place, and by the way, it's not just digging a pit, right? If you place something in the street so that someone can fall over, Torah says, I want you to view that parcel of land as if it's in your house and your garden. That is the level of personal responsibility you have to take to ensure that nothing you do causes harm to others. That is what it means. And similarly with the ox. Yes, you didn't gore the person, your ox did. But the Torah says, V'gam ba'olav yumos, and the owner shall die. The owner's not going to die because the owner will always pay the fine, clearly. But the Torah says, in that case, in fact, if he doesn't pay the fine, there is a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. But the fact that the Torah spells it out in that way is, I think, to emphasize the fact that the level of responsibility that a person has over a dangerous animal towards others means they have to develop that mindset, V'gam ba'olav yumos, that it's as if the owner would have to die. Personal responsibility in life requires nothing less than this level of responsibility, and it is essential for what it means to live as a Jew. The idea is that it is my personal responsibility, and it is no one else's. No one else can take that responsibility for me. The public can't take that responsibility. I can't throw that responsibility on someone else and say, they made a decision for me. No, no, no. The Torah says, you are responsible. You are the Baal Habor. You are the one who owns that stumbling block in the street. You're the one who put someone's eye out. It's a very sobering thought. It's something which affects, which is deep and it is personal. But it is the key towards understanding the mindset that the Torah wants us to develop, and the idea that when we talk about in Parshas Mishpatim, when we talk about the way Parshas Mishpatim develops the theme of the second set of the luchos of the Aseres HaDibros, how it fills in the gaps, how it develops that idea of what it means to be a person who lives an ethical and moral life. Ethical and moral life is only possible if a person accepts personal responsibility. How much have we had to focus on this during this entire period, during the whole previous year? Everything about the pandemic has been about personal responsibility, because every aspect of the rules requires each individual person to say to themselves, am I doing the right thing? No one's going to tell me, and no one's going to see what I do. It is a question of just me standing up and saying, is this the correct way to behave? Is this the right way, ethically and morally, to behave? It's about personal responsibility. It's about personal responsibility and sensitivity to others. Now, I always wondered, when I'm learning Parshas Mishpatim, there's a shift, which to me seems to jar. If you look at Perek Chof Beis, Posuk Tesvav, Perek Chof Beis, Posuk Tesvav, right? So you have a very solid chunk of the laws of Nezikin, of damages, right? It goes, it really goes straight through. You've got the main, the Arbal was Nezikin, you've got the main heads of damages that your property can cause, etc. You can cause, you've got the laws of Shomrim, of borrowers, you've got the laws of guardians, you've got everything is all there. Finishes off finally with the halacha of a socher, someone who rents something, a rental, and the responsibilities you have in that regard. And then you have Pesach Tesvav, the chiyafata ish b'sulah. A man seduces an unmarried girl, Ashalo Rosu is not betrothed, and he lies with her. Mohari Moreno Leisha, the rule about how he has to treat her, has a responsibility towards her. He has to provide for her Kamoyer Habasulis, if he doesn't want to marry, if the father want to marry, etc., he doesn't marry her, then he's got to pay. I have a very simple question. What is the shift from the laws of Nezikin, right, the laws of damages, to something which is a fundamentally different area of Torah? It's about marriage law. It's about behaving inappropriately in an intimate setting. And what's going on here? Again, look at the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra says like this, very brief Ibn Ezra. He says, the Ibn Ezra says, why does the Torah shift? It finishes off talking about genevas momon, about stealing people's money. Now, yedaba al genevas halev. It talks about genevas halev. It talks about stealing someone's heart. It talks about someone who is a mafata, seduces, behaves in an inappropriate way. What the Torah is doing here is demonstrating a shift, which is fundamental, because if you don't absorb what the problem is with genevas momon, if a person is not sincere and honest in business, in the way they treat, the way they relate to other people in a monetary sense, what will happen is that they will eventually go from there to deceit, to deception, which is what's going on here. In the case of the seduction, in the case of the mafata, from genevas momon to genevas halev, to stealing the heart. And this is built, therefore, in stages. A lack of sensitivity towards yashrus, towards uprightness, behaving in the correct way, in terms of stealing, in terms of relation to other people's property. If you want to put it in a very crude way, a lack of behaving appropriately in terms of the way one fills in tax returns leads to a lack of sensitivity in terms of genevas halev, in terms of the way one treats others, in terms of all the horrific things that can arise from trying to trick someone else. And the thing is here is that people want safety in numbers. That's what they want. Rashi, Perek Chof Gimel Posuk Beis. The Torah says Lucia achari rabim l'ro'os. What does that mean? Lucia achari rabim l'ro'os. You shall not go after others, l'ro'os, to provide, to do something negative. What does that mean, go after the majority? What does it mean, not go after the public? The rabim l'ro'os. Rashi learns in a very, very simple way. Sometimes the rabbim, the public, do the wrong thing. Sometimes you've got to turn around and you've got to stand up and you've got to say, I'm going to do the right thing. The defense that everyone does this is not a defense. What is the result of developing this mindset? Let me share with you a brief but incredible story. The story is told as follows. 65 years ago, there was a man called Rav Yitzchok Feigelstein. He was traveling in a car with Rav Aaron Kotler. They were traveling to a meeting in Philadelphia. They were establishing a yeshiva in Philadelphia. They were traveling from New Jersey to Philadelphia. Rav Aaron Kotler was exhausted. It was a hot day. There was no air conditioning in those times in the cars. So he's sitting on the back seat. And in the front seat is the driver and the man, this rabbi, he asked to accompany him. They're going over the bridge from Philadelphia into New Jersey. And Rav Aaron notices out of the corner of his eye, 2 12-year-old non-Jewish boys who are trying to hitch a lift on the side of the road. Now, the driver did the obvious thing, right? If you're sitting in a car with the man who is the Gadol Hador, right? He was the leading senior rabbi in America. What do you do when people stick out their thumbs trying to hitchhike? 2 non-Jewish boys standing by the side of the road hitchhiking. What do? You carry on driving, right? That's what he did. And Rav Aaron turns to the driver and says, did you notice, he says, did you see that there were 2 boys on the side of the road looking for a lift? And the driver said, I don't pick up hitchhikers because they can hurt you. They could be dangerous. And Rav Aaron says, but they're kids. They're just 2 kids. And we should add, of course, as a rider to this was the day when people were probably more comfortable picking up hitchhikers 65 years ago. Rav Aaron said, they're only kids. And he says, still, they could also hurt you. But Rav Aaron didn't give up. And he said in Yiddish, Die Mama wird sorgen auf sie. The mother will be worried about them. And he kept saying to the driver. They traveled 6 miles past the bridge. And finally, the driver turns around to Rav Aaron Kotler and says, what does the Rosh Yeshiva want from me? What should I do? Do you want me to drive back and pick up the boys? And Rav Aaron said to him, do you have a better idea? And they drove back, and the 2 boys were still there. And the person sitting in the front joined the Rosh Yeshiva in the back of the car. They squeezed the 2 boys into the front, and they drove the kids home so that a mother somewhere in New Jersey wouldn't worry needlessly about her children. And that is the outcome of developing a sense of personal responsibility. That is really what underpins Parshas Mishpatim. Mishpatim fills in those gaps. It develops within us a sense of what it means to live an ethical and moral life, a sense of what it means to live a life where it is as if we genuinely feel we are the Baal Habar, we are the one responsible for that. We have a sense, above all, of personal responsibility, things that transpire, things that take place around us, things that come our way in life, moral dilemmas, decisions that we have to make. The ethic of personal responsibility is absolutely fundamental to what it means to be a Jew. It's fundamental to understanding not just this parsha, but understanding every other parsha in the Torah, which is why this follows immediately after the Aseres HaDibros. When we can develop that mindset, we can develop that sense of no one's going to do this for me in life. Sometimes the majority of people do the wrong thing, but I've got to do what's right. I've got to do what my personal responsibility, my ethical responsibility tells me is the right thing to do through, of course, the lens of the Torah itself. And when we do that, then we truly live the lifestyle that the Torah wants us to live. Thank you all for listening and for joining this evening. I wish you all a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, good Chodesh. Beautiful, thank you.
Good Chodesh as well, yeah.
Thank you.
Chodesh, good Shabbos.